Girl with the Silver Eyes, Chapter 3. No one came to swim in the pool all morning. After a while, Katie got tired of sitting there looking at the empty swimming pool. She discovered that if she concentrated very hard, she could make the water splash up over the edge and run in rivulets down back over the tile. Someone had left their shoes and socks beside a deck chair, and she leaned forward and tried very hard until the water rushed over the edge of the pool in a wave sufficient to wet the shoes and socks. Nobody came and found them, however, and Katie got up and began to walk around the deck. There were no name cards beside the doors on this inner courtyard, and all the draperies were drawn so that she couldn't see inside. She thought living at the Cedars Apartments was going to be pretty boring. There was a plain door sandwiched in between the sliding glass doors, and when Katie opened it, she found herself in a short corridor that led out to the main one. Well, maybe she'd give herself a tour of this floor at least, since she didn't want to go back to 2A. Not while Mrs. H was there. The card beside the bell of 2B said Michaelmas. No Mr. or Mrs., just the last name. And in front of the door sat a cat. He was a big gray Tom with a few black marks on his face that gave him an evil look, and he crouched there in a position that made Katie drop to her knees beside him. "What's the matter, cat? You look sick." "I am sick. I hurt." Surprise held her rigid. The cat hadn't spoken to her, of course he hadn't, yet the words hung in her mind as clearly as if she'd heard them. "Where do you hurt?" She didn't touch him, only hunkered down so that they were face to face. He had yellow, unblinking eyes. The door opened so unexpectedly that Katie nearly fell over. "Oh, there you are, Lobo. Well, who are you?" The lady who stood in the doorway, Mrs. Michaelmas, was as old as Grandma Welker had been. She wore a red and green and blue printed muumuu in electric colors, and her white hair hadn't been combed yet today. Later, she would learn that Mrs. Michaelmas's hair never looked as though it had been combed. "I'm Katie Welker. I live over there." She gestured at the door of 2A. "Well, glad to know you. I'm Annie Michaelmas. And that wretched creature," she pointed at the cat, "is Lobo. Lobo means wolf," Katie supplied. "Oh, do you speak Spanish?" "I can read a few words of it," Katie said, nodding. "Lobo is sick. He hurts." "He does?" For once a grown-up didn't ask as if she were crazy or weird. Mrs. M bent to pick him up, and Lobo struggled in her arms. "Where do you hurt, baby?" "I think it's a bladder infection. Bladder infections really hurt. My grandma had one once." "I did too, and you're right, they hurt." She cradled the cat against her brightly flowered bosom. "I guess I better take him to the vet's, eh?" "I think so." Katie could see beyond Mrs. M into a comfortably cluttered apartment. There were books and magazines all over it, in sleeves, on shelves, and in tables, and even on the floor. Her interest quickened. "I don't suppose you'd lend me something to read, would you, until I can go to the library? Monica, my mother, says her books aren't suitable for a 10-year-old. Mrs. M looked down at her nearsightedly. "Are you 10? Well, I guess we can't all be giants, can we? Sure, I can lend you something. What do you like? True detective stories? Science fiction? Murder mysteries?" Katie nodded. "Anything as long as it's good." "Come on in and look around. What's your name?" Mrs. M asked. Katie told her and followed her into the apartment. There was a television, but there were newspapers lying on top of it and over the edge so that they covered up part of the screen. She guessed that Mrs. M spent more time reading than watching TV. "Make yourself at home," Mrs. M said, depositing Lobo gently on a couch with orange and brown flowers on it. "I'll call and ask when Dr. Grant can see Lobo. You hungry? I got some nice fruit there on the table. Help yourself." Katie selected a bunch of purple grapes and walked between a shabby leather recliner and a chair with blue and green stripes and a red pillow in it to reach the bookshelves. Behind her, Mrs. M's voice boomed. 4 o'clock? Okay, I'll be there." She turned back, running a hand over Lobo's drooping head. "We'll take care of you, baby. Don't you worry, my friend. You find anything to read?" Katie assumed that last question was directed at her, unless Lobo was better educated than she thought he was. "I'm still looking. What's a pimpernel?" "The Scarlet Pimpernel? You've never read that?" That's one of the best books anybody ever read," Mrs. M told her. "You take that one along. You'll like it. I bet I've read it 20 times, maybe more." Katie accepted the book and sucked a grape out of its skin, swallowing the 2 parts separately. "When I finish this, can I come back and get something else?" "Sure, why not?" "Listen," Mrs. M said. "I know how it is at the vet's. I'll sit there for half an hour, and just when it's my turn to take Lobo in, somebody will bring their St. Bernard for emergency major surgery, and I'll have to wait another hour or 2. The paper boy comes to collect tonight if he's on schedule. Will you watch for him and pay him? I got the money right here. He usually comes about 5. "Okay," Katie agreed, accepting the bills. "His name's Jackson Jones," Mrs. M told her, "and he's a tall, skinny kid with 1 blue eye and 1 green one. You can't mistake him." "Really? That sounded even more peculiar than having silver eyes, having 1 blue and 1 green. All right, I'll watch for him." "When you finish The Scarlet Pimpernel," Mrs. M said, "try this one." She put another book into Katie's hand. "You like westerns? Louis L'Amour?" Katie decided she liked Mrs. M as much as she disliked Mrs. H, and since it was getting on toward lunchtime and the grapes weren't quite enough to stave off her hunger pangs, she decided she'd better go home. She had to go back out on the inner courtyard deck and in through the sliding glass doors because the front door was locked and she didn't have a key. She jumped when Mrs. H spoke from the kitchen. Somehow she'd hoped the sitter would just leave, even if that wasn't an ethical thing for a sitter to do. "Where have you been?" Katie shrugged. "Around." "Well, suppose you take yourself into your bedroom and make up your bed. You're big enough to be responsible for that." Had the woman decided that she'd imagined the things that had happened earlier? Had she talked to Monica and quit? Or had she changed her mind? Maybe, Katie thought, she ought to make sure Mrs. H didn't have second thoughts about staying on in this job. She didn't even have to concentrate very hard to smooth the sheets on her bed and then the blanket and finish up with the spread. She couldn't shift the pillow as well as she would have liked, so it was left crooked, but not much. Mrs. H was getting angry when Katie just stood there with what she took to be a stubborn look on her face. "I'm here through today," she said in a harsh voice, "and while I'm here, you'll do as you're told. Straighten up your room." "It's straightened," Katie said, and mentally whisked up a Kleenex and deposited it in the wastebasket. "I looked in there 10 minutes ago," the sitter said, "so don't tell me any lies." "Why don't you look in there now?" Katie asked, and walked past the woman and into the living room. She would have liked to sit in the big leather chair, but it smelled of tobacco from when Nathan sat there, so she chose a smaller platform rocker. She heard Mrs. H's heavy footsteps as the woman peered into the doorway of Katie's bedroom, and then she had to look up from the book she had just opened when Mrs. H towered over her. There was something menacing about her. Katie's heartbeat quickened. What would she do if Mrs. H touched her? Could she stop the woman from hitting her? "How do you do it?" the sitter asked. "Do what?" Katie assumed the air of an injured innocent that had baffled so many and frustrated her grandma and her teachers and the other adults around her. For a moment more, Mrs. H stood there, and then she turned and marched out of the room. Katie heard her in the kitchen. She wished she'd been there to overhear what the sitter had said to Monica on the phone. She assumed Mrs. H had quit and wouldn't be back tomorrow.